Welcome back to another Bible Lounge. Today we're going to be starting a new series called Made Easy. As you can guess from the series title, I'm going to be making things easy. I'm going to be taking biblical books and making them easy, making them easier to understand, or taking biblical topics such as difficult doctrines and making them palatable, making them easier to comprehend. The whole goal is not just to make it easier to understand, but also to help us know them well, okay? So with today's video, we're going to be starting off a 5-part, I guess I'll call it a mini series, and we'll be traveling through the book of Romans. The book of Romans, in my opinion, is one of the most important, if not the most important book in the Bible. And that's not to say that the whole Bible isn't important. I think that Romans sets up such a firm foundation of the Christian gospel, of Jesus' gospel. And in fact, the book of Romans is said to be responsible for the Reformation in 1517. It's a very important book in church history. It's a very important book in terms of theology, in terms of the gospel. It is Paul's gospel laid out. So yeah, every book in the Bible is important, but I especially love the book of Romans. I think there's a lot to learn in the book of Romans, but at the same time, the book of Romans is very difficult. There's a lot of difficult things in the book of Romans, and Paul says a lot. There's 16 chapters in this book. And so my hope in this 5-part mini-series is that you come away knowing Romans well, knowing it so much more maybe than you had before. And if you already know Romans, great. But I hope that these videos will help you grasp the theme and the content and the flow of Romans. The book of Romans. Have you ever read through the book of Romans and you're wondering, what is going on in this book? What is Paul talking about? I've heard, Romans is a difficult book. So we're going to today get into the introduction of Romans. We're not going to quite get into the chapters yet. So I think we need a good introduction, not only of the book, but also of how I'm going to lay out this 5-week study of the book of Romans. Okay, so what I'm going to do, and I hope as you watch these videos that you memorize these with me. Okay, so I have come up with a one-sentence or one-liner way to describe each chapter. And the reason for this is because Romans, I think, just like many of Paul's books, especially Paul's books, it's very important that we follow his line of thinking from the beginning through to the end. Okay? So from chapter 1 all the way up until, let's just say, chapter 11, Paul has a very strong, if you will, very kind of linear thinking. He does kind of bounce here and there, but it's mostly linear thinking. And it's very important that we follow along with what he's trying to teach, because each thing flows into the next. And it's very easy to take something out of context if we haven't been following from the beginning, so we can see his premises and what he's building upon in his theology and his arguments, I guess. And so I came up with a one-liner for each chapter that helps us understand the flow or the focus of that chapter. Now, I will say this is important. This doesn't mean that everything in the chapter focuses on the one-liner that I'm going to give us. What these one-liners are for is the main focus, the main theme, the main arguments, the main focus of Paul's writing. Now, there are things in those chapters that aren't exactly going according to the one-liner that I'm going to give you, but for the most part, it is. And I wanted to break them down by chapters, because that's how we know them. We know them by 16 chapters. We know Romans by 16 chapters, and also some of the one-liners that I'm going to give are more than just one chapter. Okay, so for instance, in chapter 4, here's one of them. It's justification by faith. That's how we summarize or the one-liner for chapter 4. So justification by faith. Now, chapter 3, the second half, or third, the last third, there we go, the last third of chapter 3, if you will, has also the theme of justification by faith. So we can kind of technically say it starts somewhere in chapter 3 and ends at the end of chapter 4, that heading, justification by faith. But for the sake of this video and simplicity, I'm just, if you will, titling the chapters or summarizing the chapters into these one-liners to help us to understand Paul's flow. All right? So it's not really been debated in history as to who wrote the book of Romans. It's the Apostle Paul. I don't think there's anybody that really debates that. So the Apostle Paul wrote Romans. Where did he write Romans from? Most likely what happened is Paul had gathered up the money from the Gentile church, and he was on his third missionary journey. And he, at this point when he wrote Romans, was most likely in Corinth, staying for a few months, about to head out to Jerusalem to help with those in need in Jerusalem, because there was, I think, a famine going on, and they were low on funds. And so Paul gathered money from the Gentile church to bring it to, if you will, the Jewish community there in Jerusalem to help them out. And so Paul is now in Corinth, and at this point in time in Paul's journey, he had not yet visited Rome. Paul really had a desire to visit Rome. We see this in chapter 1. The first half of chapter 1 describes all of this, what I'm about to say. Okay, so Paul had a desire to visit Rome. He had a desire to preach the gospel to them in Rome. But also, as we see in chapter 15, Paul actually wants to use Rome as sort of a base to promote further missionary ventures all the way through to Spain. Paul desired to preach the gospel where it had not yet been preached, as a Gentile, as a apostle to the Gentiles, And so Rome was on the way. So it was kind of like a two birds with one stone thing. Paul wanted to visit Rome to preach the gospel there, and also to use Rome as a springboard to get to Spain and preach the gospel there. Now, Rome is a peculiar church. We don't know who started the Roman church. The best guess is that Peter's sermon in the book of Acts, where he preached to 3,000, it was probably mostly Jews. Maybe some of them got saved and were from Rome, and they brought the gospel back, and somehow a church started. As far as we know, no apostle had visited Rome up until that point where Paul was writing. It's possible maybe Peter. We don't honestly know. But it seems that no apostle had really established a firm grasp of the gospel there. Maybe they were lacking this firm gospel understanding. And so Paul's desire was to come as an apostle with that apostolic authority and give a firm theological, doctrinal just grasp of the gospel and really set the gospel in stone for the Roman church, because they were a great church. Their faith was renowned, and we see this all in chapter 1. And so Paul definitely desires to preach the gospel there, and we know eventually he makes it to Rome, but he gets arrested in Jerusalem, and he does make it to Rome at some point, but he's in prison, and then he, in fact, I don't think ever leaves Rome. You know, there's possibility he was released and then went back to prison and then died, but nevertheless, I don't think he ever makes it to Spain. This book was probably written in AD 57 or around that time. And yeah, so that's kind of an intro of the book of Romans. Okay, so the theme of Romans, if you haven't guessed yet, is the gospel. It is Paul laying out a very long treatise. It's a full book, if you will, on the gospel, mostly from chapters 1 through 11. And with that, that's how the book is broken down. So chapters 1 through 11 would be, again, like I said, the theological, and chapters 12 through 16 is the practical. So in chapters 1 through 11, you have really the heart, the meat of the gospel, the theology, the doctrine of the gospel message, according to Paul, if you will. And so, to give you a broad overview of the book of Romans, this will help for the future coming videos, okay? So chapters 1 through 4 can be summarized like so: justification by faith. So Paul lays out his arguments that all people must come to faith in Jesus to be saved, that all people are guilty before God, that no one stands innocent or justified in the Lord's eyes, and must come to the Lord in faith and receive of the righteousness that comes through faith, like Abraham. Paul uses Abraham as an example in Romans chapter 4. So that is very important. So his whole argument up until chapter 4 is that all people, Jew and Gentile, are guilty before God and must come to God in faith to receive of the righteousness that comes through faith, as opposed to the one that comes through the law, because we can't uphold the law fully and receive the righteousness. And then you have chapters 5 through 8. So in that section, rather than the peril of man, we can summarize this section really. I guess I would call it life in the Spirit. It's now Paul giving a more of a detailed account of what life in the Spirit looks like. So being new in Christ and being dead to sin, being dead to the law, no longer having to abide under the Old Testament law, because we are now in the Spirit. And of course, chapter 8 really brings this to a head in its marvelous words, right? I don't know what else to say in the marvel of what chapter 8 is in describing the various things. I don't want to mention anything until we get there, but it's quite a wonderful chapter. And then you have chapters 9 through 11. Chapters 9 through 11, Paul kind of deals with Israel. He really wants to focus on the fact that God's not done with Israel, and that Israel failed to receive the gospel, to receive the righteousness through faith. And yet that doesn't void God's promises to Israel, and also that God has a future plan for Israel. So we can call chapters 9 through 11, God's not finished with Israel. And then chapters 12 through 16, again, that's the practical stuff. And really that's just living out the gospel now. So chapter 12 would be Christian way of life, and chapter 13 and 14 and really it's chapters 12 through 14 is mostly this practical application stuff. And then chapter 15, Paul lays out some of his plans of what he wants to do in Rome and how he wants to go to Spain. And also in chapter 16, it's a very long greeting, and then he gives a final warning. And really that's the book of Romans, if you will, in a nutshell. And each subsequent week, we are going to break down each of those sections a little bit more in detail. We're going to memorize the chapter titles so that we can memorize the book of Romans. It'll help us to understand Paul's flow of thought in the book of Romans. So I encourage you to continue to follow along, to memorize the chapter headings. I will post them here down below, and also I'll put them up real quick on the end of this video. But yeah, that was the intro to the book of Romans.